A set pattern of sleeping, waking, dictated by day and night. An animal like this, of course, is also dictated by having to prepare for the winter. They hibernate, or they go south. They store food and other such behavior. Now, we all know different animals that do that type of thing. Now, this is a painting. It's a little hard to tell, but this is a painting by Van Gogh, a very famous painting. Everybody knows who Van Gogh is? Yeah, everybody knows the ear part. Well, the other part is he's turning in his grave now because that painting's worth about $60 million. He never sold one of his paintings for more than $10. And he went crazy, or maybe he was always crazy, and he killed himself. Didn't live too good of a life, I'll say that. But his paintings now are worth a small fortune, a ransom. This is an interesting painting. It shows a whole series, and he did a whole series of these sunrises and sunsets. Now, man is really a subject of three natural timekeeping cycles that we discussed for the measurement of time. The Earth's rotation. Now, those of you who recall that last discussion we had, even though I was talking about the New York City history, I also talked a little bit about the Earth. And in fact, I can come back the next time. We'll do one just on the Earth. The Earth, the poles, and New York City. If we are very quiet right now, do you feel any movement? No, right? We're solid here. There's no movement. Do you know that we're traveling about 1,000 miles an hour right now? Traveling 1,000 miles an hour. The Earth is rotating 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. Up here, maybe it's about 800, 700. You get to the pole, the North Pole, 0. Right at the pole, it's 0. Similarly in the South. So we're actually creatures of movement, though we don't even know it. If it ever stopped, we'd be flung off. The atmosphere would be ripped off. It's a very unusual planet that we're on, that we're discovering. So the first part of the measurement of time is, as I said, the Earth's rotation, which allows for the Nile and how they figured out, the Egyptians, that this was, gee, on a regular basis, the Nile seems to flood. The second day, as we discussed, the one day of sunrise, to darkness, to sunrise. And of course, then the new moon. The moon, of course, revolves around the Earth. The year, of course, is the Earth's revolution around the sun, which is called a solar year. Now, guess what? How fast the Earth goes around the sun. Take a stab at it. Go ahead. That's what we count. Okay, 300 of those sunrises to sunrises. That's correct. But you know the actual speed? They've computed the speed. 65,000 miles per hour. That's how fast we go around the sun. We are creatures of movement. Have you ever seen, there is a film, and I think the library used to have it. It would be interesting to pull it out again. It's a film of, a great film. It shows the universe, and with all the different stars, but the spaces between the stars. And then it keeps coming down, 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 eventually goes down to a man and his lady friend at a picnic in a park. And then it goes into the man's, this is just the filming, goes into the man's hand, and eventually works its way into his cell structure, and it looks just like the stars with the spaces. There's actually space between us, between everything. Is it solid? It's not solid. Between the atoms, there's spaces. And there's a time involvement in all of this. Science is quite an interesting thing to study now. Everything else that we've discussed and will discuss, like that time chronometer right over there, that clock that we call, is arbitrary. We made it up. Somebody made it up. And somebody has agreed to it. If any of the cycles actually work together neatly, that would be great. But they don't. The moon doesn't seem to work quite with the stars. They all seem to be off a little bit. And so we've had to develop over time the fractions. Now, the solar year, you said 365 days. It's actually 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, 45.9678 seconds. The Egyptians, the Chinese, and the Mayans, right, each separately figured out the unevenness of the solar year. And so they all approximated it to 365.25 days. Now that seems to make sense to us today. That's what we seem to work with today. 365 quarter days, which means what? Every 4 years we have what's called a leap year. Our favorite is February 29th. Remember that? We got stuck on that one. The great Caesar, around 42, what we call in BC or BCE, before the Common Era or the Common Era, before Christ. There's a lot of different names for this now. But it's what we call zero, but before zero, and it actually wasn't zero. There never was a zero. He changed the calendar because it was 11, it was always off. And his new calendar set up the official business of having these leap years every 4 years. Because the problem was his calendar was 11 minutes off. 11 minutes doesn't sound like much, right? But guess what happens over a decade? How about 100 years? How about 1,000 years? I mean, after a while, we're talking about 11 days. So they're always trying to keep it attached, at least the Christians were, to Easter. It was hard to do that because it kept being removed further and further away. The Mayans, who were the first to use zero, also used the number 20 as their base. They didn't use 10 as a base number. They used 20. Very unusual how they came up with this. And they set up 18 months of 20 days each. The Romans initially had 10 months of 30 and 31 days. And then about 700, what we're calling BCE, they established this 12-month ideal. And that's the first time we see this 12-month. And that's continued from 700 BC to 2000. That's 2,700 years of 12 months in some capacity. Now the Muslims, any Muslims here? Because you don't follow this. You follow it differently. What's the month today? What's the month and date? Ah, okay. I'm not going to embarrass you. What's the month and date? Anyone? Of what month? It's all right. We will hold you to it. The point is that we'll talk a little more about the Muslims in a bit of time, because they have an unusual calendar, completely different from the one that we are following. Completely different in that it keeps running ahead, and so you never could count on Ramadan being at the same time. It's not like Christmas being at the same time. It doesn't work that way. Okay, but we'll discuss that in a moment. Let's see. So all major societies in human history were predominantly lunar calendars to start off, that must establish some way to reconcile the solar year. So the Chinese, the Jews, the Muslims eventually all worked, and they still have a lunar calendar that they work from. They know this calendar that we work from. So a lunar calendar, still do. Yeah, their calendar goes back to 5600 as well. Oh, yes. Well, it makes sense. You know, the ones who would keep it are the ones who had it the longest time. I mean, that's really what you're looking at. The Chinese, the Jews, and the Muslims, they just kept, and they separate themselves, and that's what they've kept. Of course, they know the regular calendar that everybody else is using.
Okay, one question. In 700 BC, 12 months.
12 months came in. 12 months came in.
By whom?
Romans. Now remember, it's the Greeks and then the Romans ruled the world, the known world. Of course, that's a joke to the Chinese. What world did they know? The Chinese ruled their world. But to those, and the Mayans ruled their world. I mean, the Mayans had the greatest cities with larger populations than any other place in the world, it turns out. Around 100 AD, we'll call AD. Right? About 100, they had the biggest cities. Who would even imagine that? We didn't even know that up to about 100 years ago.
Say the Greeks and Romans established the 12 months?
Well, I don't want to completely say that because I go a little further, but it's really the Egyptians who established the idea of the 12 months. But the Romans espoused it. And so it became a Roman idea. And of course, it was a Roman world and was so until about 450 AD. So it's the Romans who truly established the 12 months. But 12 is an interesting number, as is 7. 7's a lucky number for many, many different societies. Now, why is 7 important? Well, how did they decide 7 days a week? That's the big problem before us.
You said the great Caesar.
The first Caesar, Julius. They named, after that, everybody who became the king was called Caesar in the Roman world. Okay, Caesar and king are the same words, but the first Caesar was Julius Caesar.
He's the one that's attributed to the time thing?
Yes, he's the one that changed the calendar, and that's why we call it a Julian calendar. That was the Julian calendar that established the leap year, but didn't account for that 11 minutes off, because he couldn't. How could he figure it out at the time? Okay, but he was using Egyptian and Babylonian astronomers to help him. What's that? He was the king, what we'll call the king. He's actually the dictator. It's a different term used then. But he was, think of it as the king. He was in charge. Okay? He was the one in charge. Now, one of the things, I'll just throw this out, there is a thing to realign the lunar calendars. It's a problem, the lunar calendars. So in the 5th century BC, an Athenian, a Greek astronomer named Meton, devised something that was separately devised by the Chinese and the Babylonians, which is interesting, that the shortest sequence of years to bring the solar and the lunar calendars into alignment is 19 years. Now, what does that really mean? What he said was that you have to add an extra leap month, a 13th month, in order to make the lunar calendars fit, so that they can count on when Easter was going to come around. Easter was supposed to be a very specific time. Now, as it turns out, the Muslims decided not to take this, but of course they're later. Their calendar starts at 622 when Muhammad flees to Medina. Okay, so let's just hear this for a while. The Jewish calendar, for example, places its 13th month of 30 days in the 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19 years of this 19-year cycle. It explains why Hanukkah, if anyone ever noticed that other holidays always seem to go around Christmas, sometimes it's in front of it, sometimes it's behind it, it always seems to be different. That's because it's a lunar calendar. That's why. Okay. Let's see, to make it nice and easy. Ramadan, as in the Muslim calendar, keeps moving backward in what we're going to call the Gregorian calendar, which we'll get into in a moment. And while the Islamic calendar is lunar, it doesn't fix itself to the Metonic cycle. It doesn't add any leap months. So nothing is fixed. All their dates continuously move forward in the calendar of the one we're using today. So that's why Ramadan, just to use the biggest holiday, one of the bigger holidays, is always moving around. So sometimes it's when is it this year? Yeah, we had it already, right? It was late December. Late December. Okay. You know when it's going to be next year? When it's Thanksgiving. You see how it's moving up? And then it works its way around the calendar once again. Okay? Now, let's continue. We try not to make this too convoluted, because it is a convoluted subject, though we try and make it as simple as possible. Like the animals, man's time is marked by the seasons. Man can always tell, all the farmers could tell, hunters could tell, fishermen could tell, the changing weather, when to plant, when to harvest, when to go out and bring in his crops, bring in his oysters, his fish, especially when winter is coming. Everybody could tell that. And through the long winters, it must have occurred to man, especially the men who lived in the northern climates, that he should measure time a bit more accurately so he could predict and plan for the future. Well, that makes a lot of sense, right? If he runs out of food before the planting season occurs, what happens? They're gone. They're gone. How many people knew that the Norsemen lived in Greenland for 500 years? From about 1000, this is all AD, to about 1500 until they disappeared. Well, why did they disappear? It's very cold up there. Yeah, and they got a little colder and colder, and then they couldn't plant anymore, and their animals seemed to live much longer, and they finally disappeared. But they were there for 500 years and completely disappeared. They're just one of many civilizations that happens to. This is Stonehenge, the Celtic, we'll call it the monument. Nobody's really sure exactly what it is, but it seems it's in England. How many people have seen this? It's an extraordinary thing. These stones are about 20 feet tall. And here these people, without machinery, remember, they built this extraordinary circle. This is a circle. It doesn't give you a fair shake. And what it's supposed to be is a planetarium. And so at the solstice, or the equinox, the sun was supposed to come through certain stones. So man's awe of nature and its regularity, at least in terms of its seasons, caused them to sanctify the recording of natural events. So the measurement of solar, lunar movements around a place like Stonehenge, which was built around 2000 BC, was most likely all run by priests, always would be run by a priest class. And as I said before, ancient civilizations, from the Babylonians to the Aztecs, to the Mayans, to the Aztecs, they had priests who were in charge of the calendar and astronomical calculations. They didn't have a thing that we call today scientists. The priests were the scientists, but they had to keep within the realm of what was the religion. You step out, you're done. There's no expansion except if the ruler agreed to it. So that's why things moved, but then they didn't move that fast. Surely these men who are studying this would have appeared wonderful when they predicted such a thing as an eclipse of the sun. Now Thales, the first Greek philosopher, gained fame because he predicted an eclipse of the sun in 585 BC. And the holders of time, which is what they were called the time holders, were considered to be some of the most important people in any of their societies. They're the ones who kept track of when the harvest would come in. When you'd have the celebration for the harvest, when you'd honor whatever god you're honoring that particular period of time. Now this one here, a little tough to see, but we'll make it a little easy for you. This is Teotihuacan. You really need to be a little darker. It's a little north of Mexico City. This is the great city of the Toltecs, another group like the Mayans in the Central America area. Remember, this is all jungle there. The notion that there'd be these great civilizations is quite extraordinary in a jungle environment. And yet there were these great civilizations who built enormous temples. That particular temple there, which is it's solid. It's not, you can barely make it out, but it's right there. It's called the Temple of the Sun. It's bigger than the pyramids. It's an enormous structure, The ancient Mexican city of Teotihuacan means place of the gods, where according to the legend, the gods gathered after the sun died, meaning when the sun went down. One by one, they would throw themselves into the fire so the sun would rise up once again, according to the legend anyway. This is the pyramid of the sun to the left, and the pyramid of the moon is right above us, right where we're standing, right where this picture is taken. This is a picture of the Parthenon in the Greek Acropolis on a hill in Athens. Most cultures incorporated the measuring of time into their religious rituals. The ancient Greeks, for example, built their temples to face east to west. So the golden statue of the goddess Athena stood facing east in the Parthenon in Athens so that she would greet the rising sun. Very clear about what they were doing with this. Here's a picture of the cloisters in Manhattan, northern Manhattan. This was brought over here, remember. This particular structure was brought here, I believe from Spain. The medieval monasteries also were situated from east to west. The prayers of the monks and the nuns were said at very specific times, dictated originally by the place of the sun. The Angelus, or the noonday prayer, is just such an example. And of course, well, in the Muslims, of course, where are you facing? You're always facing what? East, right? Why are you facing east? What? Yeah. Of course, what if you're west of Mecca? What if you're east of Mecca? What if you're east of Mecca? Right. Always face Mecca. That's the key. As we move along here, we see now spring. Well, spring, you know, we say that man developed civilizations to reckon time more accurately for the practical purposes of recording, well, the past and planning for the future. Also to keep track of trade. When people, natural events, the most obvious, of course, is the cycle of the sun. When you had equal day and night, that might have been a little tough to do, but certainly, which is called the equinox, certainly the one that they had, the solstice, when it got the darkest the most up in the northern area, that's pretty rough, right? When it gets very dark, and it stays dark most of the day, most of the night, and the night seems to be much longer than the day, well, it reaches a point where that's the longest night, or the longest day. Well, those were specific times, and you could tell when you're getting close to it. All of us could tell that now. You could feel it in your bones. You've heard expressions about it. There's folklore about it, legends about how people responded to the longest day or the longest night. Winter, the winter solstice, about December 23rd, the sun is directly overhead at noon over the Tropic of Capricorn. This is the longest day in the southern hemisphere and the shortest day for us in the northern hemisphere. And as I said before, as the sun completes its orbit around the sun, it's this unusual 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and those seconds as well. which makes up the system. That's a great shot, but you can't tell what that is. That's the moon. I've never seen it look so small and now, have you ever driven on a highway late at night? You come up on a hill, and all of a sudden the moon filled up the sky. What explains that to you? Doesn't it strike you? Wow, right? Think what it did 3,000 years ago. Think what it did to someone just waking up in the middle of the night, and he put his family to bed, and he just farmed the whole day, and he sees a moon that's so big it's taken up the entire sky, and then it doesn't. It disappears, and it gets smaller again. Would he not think that this was some religious thing that he's seeing, that he's being part of? Well, you can rest assured he would. That's for sure. Okay, now let's get to this next one. Here we got the Babylonians now. Now this is the Babylonian sun god. This is a relief. Remember, history is oftentimes the survivor's tale. It's the one who wins the battle and then destroys everything else. So if you go down into Mexico, you would never know that there were these great civilizations until the archaeologists, the study of the ancient work under the ground, found out and took things out that they couldn't believe, and finally figured out the language that they had. But if you initially went down there the last 100 years, it's only Spanish culture. Any Mexicans here? Any Mexican people? They think it's all from Spain. Except that every once in a while you see people, you know, there's a new Mexican restaurant. It's actually not new anymore. A little tamale place right up, I'm sort of twisted around here. Wherever we are, off of Kingsbridge Road, right? You take a look at some of those fellas. They look like they actually came out of they're Mayans. They have the face of Mayans. They're pure. They're pure Mayans. They weren't mixed. There was no mixing of their tribes and of their people. This is one of the earliest calendars that we have, an actual calendar, based again on the cycle of the moon. This is the Babylonians. Here they had a 12 months, 3 to 30 days, or about 360 days to the year. From this cycle, they divided a circle into 360 days and 360 degrees. And this is really the first time we now see the circle being broken up into 360 degrees. Think of what that means. The whole notion of what a circle was, and how you could measure things and how you could build things because you knew how the circle was created. So mathematics is like the keystone of all the science, and which became, in our case, the calendar of our discussion today. This was apparently the basis for the division of the day into hours and minutes. Now these were great leaps of abstraction, from the natural cycle of the moon to the artificial division of a circle, and then of hours, and then of minutes. And around 700 BCE, they actually established a 7-day week. But it seems that many civilizations had a 7-day or an 8-day, no more than a 9-day week, because you couldn't have people just working constantly and not stopping to trade, to talk to each other, to rest. So there always seemed to be rest points. 7 days seems to be a nice compromise. 6 days you work, 7th day you relax. Maybe you do something different. The key thing here is to do something different. Remember, they have no telephones. There's no intercommunication. We're talking about being able to get together in a market. And that's when they'd exchange information, stuff. Your family, my family, the latest problems, the latest taxes. Nothing really changes, remember. Nothing really changes in history. This is the Wailing Wall of the great temple in Jerusalem. It really needs the light off, but you make the best of it. Jewish calendar is an adjustment of the lunar calendar, the solar year. Again, they have 12 months of 30 or 29 days, and as I said, they add that extra day, extra month, every leap year, 7 times. In the year 2000, the Jewish calendar will record the year 5,761. That's a long time to go back. Long time. The new year begins around the autumnal equinox at the Rosh Hashanah holiday. And that's how they start their date. In China, it's 4698. For the Islamic calendar, the Muslims, it's 1421, because they start from the year 6222. For the Zoroastrians in India, it's 2390. Notice all these dates are different. It's whenever they decided to say this is started over there. That's when it started. The Roman Empire time, if it was still kept, would be 2755. But you see, they stopped using the old Roman Empire because the Roman Empire changed the calendar, as I said, in 45, this Julius Caesar, BCE. And he started off, and it was 709 in that year. But as I said, the Julian calendar, the Julius Caesar calendar, you know, there was a problem with it. So they had to do something. They had to change certain things. But before we get to that, we have to go to the Chinese. Here's the Buddha. The Chinese calendar, as we said before, is a lunar one, which they have adopted to the solar year. But they measure the 6 and 60-day cycles. They had leap months, shorter periods. The Chinese calendar runs in 60-year cycles. It's a little different way in which they work. But notice 60, that number comes up again. Remember 60 minutes, 60 seconds? 60-year cycles. And they use 12 animals designating the years. The coming year is the year of the, what is the year right now? I've changed.
Rabbit.
This is the year of the rabbit. And next year is the year of the, you know? Ah, you see, you don't know that one. Most people don't remember because they leave it. Who do you leave it to? The calendar makers, right? They'll tell you what's next. But there's 12 animals. What are the animals anyway? It's the rat is one. The cow is one, isn't it?
Tiger is
The tiger, dragon. Is a sheep? Sheep? I think it's a goat. I think it's a goat. No, no monkeys. But there are 12. Mouse, the year of the mouse. It's not big, small, it's very strange, but this is what they chose. Oh, and the snake year. Oh yeah, that's a tough year. That's always a tough year. The snake year comes around. Now here we have the a very interesting drawing of the medieval Islamic astronomers. The Muslims are the only people who use a purely lunar calendar, as I've explained. Their calendar has approximately 354 or 355 days per year. Consequently, their seasons and their months have no connection to each other. And their holidays, as we said, are never the same. The Muslim year, as we've stated before, is dated from 622, the day after the flight of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. This one didn't come out well at all. Really needed dark. This is a great stone. This is the Mayan sunstone, as they call it, the Aztec sunstone. I think I have a... No, I took out the other picture. Let me put it back. Right, make do as best you can see it. This is a... This is what they call the Mayan or Aztec sunstone. It had a 365-day year in this giant stone, and this is a giant stone, to say the least. It was discovered in 1790 in Mexico City. They were digging to build a new building, and they discovered this huge black basaltic block that's 12 feet tall. I'm sorry, 12 feet diameter, and it weighed about 24 tons in weight. Here was recorded all the ideas about the universe, and in the Aztec and Mayan view of the world, a century is not 100 years, it's 52 years. But it also could have been a sacrificial stone. They're not really sure about how that worked. They still have to read more, they have to find more things. The Mayans calculated the true passage of the Earth around the sun to be the closest of any, and this is 2,000 years ago, or thereabouts, closest of any other civilization before computers. They figured it out somehow or another. When you study the stars, and you have these people really studying the mathematics to it, they're able to do amazing work. But you notice, it's around the world that this is happening. It's not one place. No one can claim one thing. What's great about our library is that all the information comes here, right? It's here in this place. That's what makes public libraries the greatest things in the world. Not every, as you know, not every society has them. This is a relief from the Cairo Museum. Goes back to 1500 BC. And this is King Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. She was his daughter. They adored the sun. He changed over all the gods. He said the one main god was going to be the sun. Makes a lot of sense. The whole idea of one god was coming into some four. Most of the time, these places had many, many gods. But now the Jews were one of the first to have one god, study one god. Here the Egyptians tried it. So for the Egyptians, the sun was the giver of life and the provider of time, as they were tied to the floods of the Nile River. For the solar year, they would watch the stars and the constellations and the sun for the expected yearly change along with the Nile flood. Thus, their calendar was oriented towards the solar year, and it was 365